The autumn wind of 1889 carried the scent of dying leaves through the valley where Milford stood, a town so small it appeared on no official maps. Elena Ashford arrived there on a grey October morning, riding in a wagon driven by a silent man who'd met her at the nearest railway station 15 miles distant. She was 23 years old, dressed in morning black that had grown shabby from months of wear, and she carried everything she owned in a single carpet bag. Her aunt, whom she'd never met, had died suddenly 3 months prior, leaving Elena a small house and a teaching position at the town's only school. It was an unexpected mercy. Elena had been working as a seamstress in Philadelphia, barely earning enough to pay rent in a boarding house where the walls were thin and the landlady suspicious. The letter from the solicitor had seemed like providence, a home, employment, independence. The town materialized gradually from the mist. Wooden buildings lined a single unpaved street. A church steeple rose above bare trees. Smoke drifted from chimneys in thin grey columns. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional bark of an unseen dog. The driver stopped before a narrow house painted white, its shutters closed against the morning chill. He deposited her bag on the porch without a word and drove away before Elena could thank him. She stood alone, key in hand, staring at the door that now belonged to her. Inside, the house smelled of dust and lavender. The furniture was simple but well-maintained, a writing desk, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the room upstairs. On the desk lay a letter addressed to her in her aunt's spidery handwriting. Elena broke the seal and read. "My dear niece, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry we never met. There are things I should have told you, warnings I should have given. Be careful in Milford. The town has secrets buried deep. Keep to yourself. Trust no one, especially not Thomas Ashford. He will seem kind, but he is not. Destroy this letter after reading. God keep you safe. Your Aunt Catherine." Elena's hands trembled as she folded the paper. Thomas Ashford. The name meant nothing to her, yet her aunt had thought it important enough to include as a deathbed warning. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove, watching the paper blacken and curl, wondering what her aunt had known and why she'd never spoken of it while alive. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town. Elena arrived the next morning to find 12 children waiting, ranging in age from 6 to 14. They watched her with expressions that seemed too solemn for their years, as if childhood had been pressed out of them by some invisible weight. She introduced herself and began the lesson, teaching arithmetic and reading from texts her aunt had left behind. The children responded well enough, though they spoke little and avoided her eyes. At midday, a girl of perhaps 10 approached her desk hesitantly. "Miss Ashford, may I ask something?" "Of course. Did your aunt tell you about the ledger?" Elena paused, confused. "What ledger?" The girl's face paled. She glanced toward the door as if checking for listeners. "Never mind, miss. I shouldn't have asked." Before Elena could respond, the door opened and a man entered. He was perhaps 50 years old, tall and well-dressed in a dark suit that spoke of wealth. His hair was silver, his face handsome despite the hardness around his mouth. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Ashford, forgive the intrusion. I am Thomas Ashford. Welcome to Milford." The name struck her like a physical blow. She stood slowly, suddenly aware of how small the room felt, how closely he was watching her. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for your welcome. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Your aunt and I were acquainted. I'm the principal landowner here. Most of the families work my fields or timber operations. If you need anything, you need only ask." His tone was pleasant, his words generous, but something in his gaze made Elena's skin prickle with unease. He was studying her face too carefully, as if searching for something. "That's very kind, but I believe I have everything I need." "I'm sure you do. Your aunt was always self-sufficient. Tell me, did she leave you anything besides the house? Papers, perhaps? Letters?" The question seemed casual, but Elena sensed weight beneath it. "Only household items, Mr. Ashford, nothing of consequence." He smiled again, and this time she saw something cold flicker in his expression. "Of course. Well, I won't keep you from your students. I look forward to seeing you at Sunday services. Everyone attends church in Milford, Miss Ashford. It's expected." He left, and Elena realized she'd been holding her breath. The children remained silent, watching her with expressions that might have been pity or fear. The girl who'd asked about the ledger kept her eyes fixed on her desk, her small hands clenched together. That night, Elena searched her aunt's house thoroughly. She found nothing unusual, no letters, no diary, no papers of any kind beyond household accounts and teaching materials. But in the cellar, behind a loose stone in the wall, her fingers touched something cold and metallic. A key. It was old, made of iron, tarnished with age. Attached to it by a thin wire was a small tag bearing a single word written in faded ink: courthouse. Elena held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, wondering what door it opened and what secrets might lie behind that door. Her aunt's warning echoed in her mind: trust no one, especially not Thomas Ashford. She slept poorly that night, and when she finally drifted off, she dreamed of ledgers filled with names, of doors that opened onto darkness, of a man with silver hair who smiled while the world burned around him. Sunday came cold and grey. Elena dressed in her best morning clothes and walked to the church at the center of town. The building was plain white clapboard with narrow windows and a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side, as if the earth beneath it had shifted over the years. The congregation was already assembled when she arrived, perhaps 70 people sitting in rigid rows, their faces uniformly solemn. A space had been left empty in the third pew, and she understood it had been her aunt's place. She sat, feeling the weight of eyes upon her, hearing the whisper of fabric as people turned to stare. Thomas Ashford sat in the front row, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light filtering through the windows. Beside him sat a woman Elena assumed was his wife, pale, thin, with nervous hands that never stopped moving. Their daughter, a girl of perhaps 16, sat ramrod straight, her face beautiful and empty as a porcelain mask. The minister was an elderly man whose sermon focused on obedience, duty, and the proper order of things. His voice droned on about the wages of pride and the necessity of accepting one's place in the divine hierarchy. Elena found her attention wandering, studying the faces around her. Everyone looked tired, worn down, as if joy had been systematically extracted from their lives. After the service, women gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices that ceased whenever Elena approached. Men stood apart, smoking pipes and casting sidelong glances in her direction. She felt like a curiosity, something to be examined and judged. "Miss Ashford," Thomas Ashford materialized beside her, his wife trailing behind like a shadow. "May I introduce my family, my wife Margaret and my daughter Constance?" Elena nodded to each in turn. Margaret's handshake was limp and cold. Constance didn't offer her hand at all, merely studied Elena with eyes that seemed calculating beyond her years. "We'd be honored if you'd join us for Sunday dinner," Ashford said. "It would give us an opportunity to discuss the school and the education of our young people. I take a personal interest in such matters." Elena wanted to refuse, but she sensed that declining would mark her as difficult, someone who didn't understand the unspoken rules of this place. "That's very kind, Mr. Ashford, thank you." The Ashford house stood at the edge of town, a large structure of dark wood and narrow windows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside, the rooms were furnished expensively, but without warmth, everything perfectly arranged, nothing suggesting actual human habitation. Dinner was served by a silent woman in servant's dress who moved through the dining room like a ghost. The food was adequate but tasteless. Margaret Ashford barely touched her plate, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her fork. Constance ate with mechanical precision, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Tell me, Miss Ashford," Thomas said, cutting his meat with deliberate strokes. "What are your impressions of our town?" "It seems quieter." "Yes, we value quietness here. Privacy. People in Milford understand the importance of minding their own affairs and not asking questions about matters that don't concern them." The words were pleasant enough, but the emphasis was unmistakable. Elena set down her fork carefully. "I'm a schoolteacher, Mr. Ashford. My only concern is educating the children entrusted to my care. Of course, your aunt felt the same way initially. Then she began, overstepping, asking questions, examining records that weren't her concern. It made things difficult. What kind of questions? His smile hardened, the kind that disturbed the peace of a community. Your aunt was troubled by certain historical matters, property transactions, labor arrangements, family relationships. She couldn't understand that some things are best left in the past. Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. What happened to her? She died, Miss Ashford, a fall down the stairs in her home, very tragic. The doctor said her heart had given out. She was not a young woman. He paused, watching her reaction. I hope you'll be more careful on those stairs. They can be treacherous. The threat was delivered with such pleasant courtesy that Elena almost missed it. Almost. She forced herself to smile, to nod, to finish her meal while her heart hammered against her ribs. As she was leaving, Margaret Ashford caught her arm with surprising strength. The older woman's eyes were wide and frightened, her voice barely a whisper. Don't look for it. Whatever she left you, don't look. It only brings suffering. Mrs. Ashford, I don't understand. Margaret, Thomas's voice cut through the air like a blade. His wife released Elena's arm and stepped back, her face draining of color. Elena walked home quickly, her mind racing. The key burned in her pocket where she'd carried it, afraid to leave it behind. Whatever she left you, don't look. But her aunt had wanted her to find it. Why else hide a key with instructions? That night, lying in bed, Elena heard footsteps outside her house. They circled slowly, deliberately, stopping beneath her window before moving on. She didn't sleep, listening to the silence that followed, wondering if the footsteps would return. In the morning, she found a dead crow nailed to her door. Elena removed the crow with shaking hands, wrapping it in newspaper and burying it in the small garden behind her house. No one acknowledged it. The children who arrived for school that morning wouldn't meet her eyes. The parents who dropped them off hurried away without the usual brief conversations. She taught mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The courthouse stood 3 streets over, a brick building older than anything else in town, with narrow windows and a door that always remained locked. She'd passed it several times without giving it much thought. Now it occupied her imagination entirely. At midday, when the children were eating their lunches outside, the same young girl who'd asked about the ledger approached her desk again. This time, she moved with desperate urgency. Miss Ashford, please, my grandmother wanted me to tell you something. She knew your aunt. What is it? The girl glanced toward the door, then whispered rapidly. The courthouse basement. There's a record room. Your aunt found something there, something about the town's founding, about how Mr. Ashford got his land and his money. She was going to report it to authorities in the state capital, but she died before she could. My grandmother says if you go there, go at night when no one's watching, and don't tell anyone you're going. What's in those records? Names, dates, proof of what he did. The girl's voice dropped even lower. My grandmother says he stole children, bought them and sold them and claimed them as his own property even after the law said he couldn't. She says some of those children are still here, still working his land, still thinking they have no choice because he holds papers that say they belong to him. Elena felt cold understanding wash over her. 1889, 24 years after the war's end, after emancipation, after the constitutional amendments. But in isolated places like this, where no one asked questions and everyone feared the powerful, perhaps the old arrangements had simply gone underground, hidden beneath layers of fraudulent documents and terrified silence. Your grandmother, can I speak with her? The girl shook her head violently. She's afraid, everyone's afraid. He owns everything, Miss Ashford, the land, the houses, the debts. If you speak against him, you lose everything. Your home, your work, sometimes your family. People who cause trouble, they have accidents, like your aunt. Elena understood then what her aunt had discovered and why she'd died for it. And she understood why the warning had been so urgent. Trust no one, especially not Thomas Ashford. That night she waited until midnight before slipping out of her house. The key felt heavy in her pocket. Clouds obscured the moon, leaving the streets in near total darkness. She moved carefully, keeping close to buildings, avoiding the open spaces where lamplight might betray her. The courthouse loomed black against the sky. Elena circled it once, checking for watchers, then tried the front door, locked as expected, but the key in her pocket wasn't for the front door. She found the side entrance partly hidden by overgrown bushes, a narrow door leading to the basement. The key turned smoothly, as if someone had been oiling the lock. The door opened soundlessly. Inside, darkness pressed against her. She'd brought matches and a small candle, shielding the flame with her hand as she descended narrow stairs. The basement smelled of mold and old paper, that distinctive scent of documents slowly rotting in damp air. The record room was larger than she'd expected, lined floor to ceiling with shelves bearing leather-bound volumes. Deeds, birth records, death certificates, property transfers, the accumulated paperwork of a small town's existence. Elena began searching, not certain what she sought. She found it an hour later, hidden behind a false panel at the back of the room, a separate ledger bound in cracked black leather. The cover bore no title, but opening it revealed pages filled with names, dates, and monetary amounts. Her hands trembled as she read by candlelight. Sarah Price, age 14, purchased Charleston, March 18, 1857. Resold to Hammond, July 12, 1857. James Parker, age 12, purchased Richmond, October 3, 1858. Retained for fieldwork. Elizabeth Freeman, age 15, purchased Savannah, January 22, 1859. Resold to Caldwell, April 10, 1859. Page after page of children bought and sold like livestock. The entries continued through the war years, then afterward, the dates proving these transactions had occurred even after emancipation, hidden beneath layers of fraudulent indenture contracts and fabricated debts. But what made Elena's blood run cold were the final entries, dated within the last 5 years. Marcus Webb, age 16, debt claimed 1884, currently working timber operations under lifetime contract. Anna Webb, age 14, debt claimed 1884, currently household service under lifetime contract. Elena knew those names. Marcus and Anna Webb were siblings who lived in a small cabin near the timber mill. She'd assumed they were paid workers. Instead, they were slaves in all but name, trapped by fabricated debts they could never repay, working for Thomas Ashford under threat of imprisonment if they tried to leave. There were more names, at least 24 people still living in Milford, still trapped, still too frightened to speak. And at the bottom of the final page, in different ink, a notation in her aunt's handwriting. Copies made, evidence secured, must report to state authorities before he discovers what I know. Elena heard footsteps above her head. She froze, candle guttering, every muscle rigid with fear. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, moving across the floor of the courthouse directly overhead. Someone was searching the building, room by room. She extinguished the candle and stood motionless in absolute darkness, holding her breath, listening to the footsteps move closer to the basement door. Her mind raced. If she was discovered here, she would join her aunt in an early grave. No one would question another tragic accident. The footsteps stopped at the top of the basement stairs. Elena heard the door handle turn, heard the hinges creak. Light spilled down the stairs, someone with a lantern. She pressed herself against the wall beside the shelves, hidden in shadow, praying she wouldn't be seen. "I know you're down there, Miss Ashford." Thomas Ashford's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Your house was dark when I checked. Not many places you could be at this hour. Why don't you come up? We can discuss this reasonably." Elena didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hand closed around the ledger, clutching it against her chest. "Your aunt stood right where you're standing," Ashford continued, descending the stairs slowly. "She thought she was clever, thought she could expose me. She didn't understand that I've been doing this for 30 years. I know every magistrate, every lawman, every official within 100 miles. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected landowner or a young woman who's been here barely a week?" The light grew closer. Elena could see his shadow stretching long across the floor, could hear his breathing. Those records don't matter, Miss Ashford. The people whose names are in that book won't speak against me. They know what happens to those who do. And even if you managed to take that ledger out of here, even if you somehow got it to authorities who might care, how long do you think you'd survive? Roads are dangerous. Accidents happen. Young women disappear. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the record room, lantern raised high. Elena ran. She burst from her hiding place and sprinted for the stairs, the ledger clutched tight. Ashford lunged for her, his fingers brushing her sleeve, but she twisted away and threw herself up the stairs. Behind her, she heard him cursing, heard his footsteps pounding in pursuit. She reached the side door and flung it open, stumbling out into the night. The street was empty, houses dark. She ran without direction, her breath burning in her lungs, her only thought to escape, to survive, to protect the evidence in her hands. She made it halfway to her house before she realized someone was following her. Elena ran through the dark streets of Milford with the ledger pressed against her chest and Thomas Ashford's footsteps echoing behind her. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled, but terror drove her forward. She turned sharply down an alley between two buildings, hoping to lose him in the maze of back passages. The alley ended at a fence. Behind her, the footsteps grew closer. "There's nowhere to go, Miss Ashford." Ashford's voice came from the alley entrance, calm and patient. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be. Give me the ledger and we can forget this happened." Elena looked frantically for escape. The fence was too high to climb. The buildings on either side had no doors, no windows within reach. She was trapped. A hand touched her shoulder and she gasped, spinning around, but it wasn't Ashford. An elderly woman stood beside her, materializing from shadows Elena hadn't noticed before. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes sharp and knowing. "This way, quickly." The woman pulled aside what looked like loose boards against the fence, revealing a narrow gap. Elena squeezed through without hesitation, following the woman into a tangled yard overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves. Behind them, she heard Ashford cursing as he discovered the alley's dead end. The woman led her through a series of backyards and passages that seemed designed specifically for concealment. They moved in silence until they reached a small cabin at the very edge of town, barely visible among overgrown trees. Inside, a single candle burned on a rough wooden table. "Sit, catch your breath. He won't find us here. He doesn't know these paths like we do." Elena collapsed onto a chair, her whole body shaking. The woman poured her water from a clay pitcher, watching her with eyes that seemed to see everything. "You're Rebecca's niece. I knew your aunt well. My name is Hannah Webb." Elena's breath caught. "Webb, are you related to Marcus and Anna?" "My grandchildren. I'm the one who sent the message through my granddaughter at the school. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to find what your aunt found." Her eyes moved to the ledger Elena still clutched, and brave enough to do something with it. "He killed her, didn't he, my aunt?" Hannah nodded slowly. "Can't prove it, but yes. She came to me 3 days before she died, showed me copies she'd made of that ledger, said she was going to take them to the state capitol, report everything to the authorities. I warned her to be careful, told her Ashford had eyes everywhere. 2 days later she was dead. Fell down her stairs, they said. Broken neck, they said." Hannah's voice hardened. "Funny thing, I'd been to her house many times. She was careful on those stairs, always held the railing. Didn't seem the type to fall." "Did she give you the copies, the ones she made?" Hannah shook her head. "Never saw them again. I suspect Ashford found them when he searched her house after her death. He was careful to make it look like he was helping settle her affairs, but I believe he was destroying evidence. That ledger you're holding is likely the only proof left." Elena opened the book, studying the entries by candlelight. "These names, are they all still here, still trapped?" Some died, some disappeared, but 23 people in this town are working for Ashford under false debt contracts. He targets families with children, then claims the parents owe him money for housing, for food, for supposed loans he never actually gave. When they can't pay, he offers a contract, work for him until the debt is cleared, but the debt never clears. He adds charges, interest, penalties, and if you try to leave, he claims you're a criminal and has you arrested. The sheriff here is his cousin. The magistrate is in his pocket. But slavery ended 24 years ago. These contracts can't be legal. Legal enough if no one challenges them. And who's going to challenge them? The people trapped can't afford lawyers. The ones who aren't trapped are too afraid to speak up. Ashford owns most of the land here, controls most of the employment. Go against him and you lose everything. Your home, your livelihood, sometimes your life. Elena thought of the children in her classroom, their solemn faces and careful silence. How many of them had parents trapped in this system? How many had learned from birth that questioning authority meant disaster? Why did he start this? After the war, he could have just moved on, become a normal landowner. Hannah's laugh was bitter, because he's been doing this since before the war, that's why. He was a slave trader back then, made his fortune buying and selling human beings. When the war ended and that became illegal, he just found new ways to do the same thing. Changed the words but kept the system. Called it debt instead of ownership, contracts instead of bills of sale. But it's slavery all the same, just dressed up in new clothes. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it. 23 people enslaved in 1889, in a nation that claimed to have abolished such practices. And a man wealthy and powerful enough to maintain the system through fear and corruption. What can I do? If I go to authorities, he says they won't believe me. He's probably right. Most officials around here are either paid off or scared of him. You'd need to go higher, state capital, maybe federal authorities, but you'd have to get there alive, and he won't make that easy. He knows you have the ledger now. He'll be watching every road, every train station. And even if you manage to escape, what's to stop him from claiming you stole property, that you're a criminal yourself? They sat in silence for a long moment. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Outside, Elena heard night birds calling and the rustle of wind through bare trees. Your aunt had a plan, Hannah said finally. She told me about it before she died. She'd written letters to sympathetic officials in the state capital, people she'd known before she came here. She planned to take copies of the ledger and deliver them personally with her testimony. She thought if she could get the right people to investigate, if she could bring federal authorities here, Ashford's power would crumble. Local officials might be corrupted, but there were still honest men in positions of authority if you knew where to look. Do you know who she planned to contact? She mentioned a name, Senator William Harrington, said he'd been a friend of her late husband, a man who'd spoken publicly against the convict lease system and other forms of neo-slavery. She thought he'd listen, thought he'd act. Elena's mind raced. She'd need to copy the ledger, keeping the original safe while taking duplicates to the capital. She'd need to travel without Ashford knowing her destination. And she'd need help from people brave enough to stand against a man who'd held this town in his grip for decades. I'll need copies made, and I'll need to reach the train station without being seen. Hannah studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can help with that. My son Marcus's father has a wagon. We can hide you beneath hay bales. Take you the long way to the station, but you understand what you're risking. Ashford killed your aunt for less than this, if he catches you. If I do nothing, he continues enslaving people. 23 people who deserve freedom. How can I walk away from that? Hannah's face softened, something like approval flickering in her eyes. You're like your aunt. She said the same thing. I told her it would get her killed. I'm telling you the same, but I'll help you anyway because someone has to. Someone has to stand up eventually. They spent the remainder of the night making copies of the ledger's key pages. Hannah produced paper and ink from a hidden chest, and Elena worked carefully, transcribing names, dates, and amounts by candlelight. Her hand cramped and her eyes burned, but she forced herself to continue. This was evidence. This was proof. This was justice waiting to be served. As dawn approached, Hannah left briefly and returned with her son, a man in his 30s who looked exhausted beyond his years. He studied Elena with suspicion. This is dangerous, Mama. If Ashford finds out we helped her, then we're no worse off than we already are, boy. We're living under his boot either way. Might as well try to break free. He nodded reluctantly and began preparing the wagon. Elena tucked the copies of the ledger inside her dress, secured against her body where they couldn't be easily taken. The original she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and gave to Hannah. "Hide this, keep it safe. If something happens to me, someone else needs to be able to use it." Hannah accepted the bundle solemnly. "I'll keep it where he'll never find it, but you come back, you hear? Come back with those federal authorities and help us end this." The wagon ride to the train station took 3 hours, following rough back roads that avoided Milford entirely. Elena lay beneath scratchy hay bales, breathing dust and trying not to cough. Every bump and jolt sent pain through her body. She couldn't see anything, could only hear the wagon wheels and the occasional muttered conversation between Hannah's son and someone they passed on the road. They stopped once, and Elena heard voices, men asking questions about where he was headed, what he was carrying. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Hannah's son answered calmly, casually, giving some excuse about delivering supplies to a farm beyond town. The men seemed satisfied and let them pass. Finally, the wagon stopped, and the hay bales were pulled back. They'd reached a small station Elena didn't recognize, not the main stop where she'd arrived, but a smaller depot serving a different rail line. "You can catch the northbound from here, goes to the capital, train comes through in an hour." Hannah's son counted coins into her hand, money he clearly couldn't afford to spare. "For your ticket, get there safe, and when you come back, bring help, real help." Elena wanted to thank him properly, wanted to express how grateful she was, but he'd already turned away, anxious to get back before his absence was noticed. She watched the wagon disappear down the road, then turned toward the station, checking the copies secured inside her dress. She'd made it this far. Now she just had to reach the capital, find Senator Harrington, and convince him to act. How hard could that be? The answer came as she approached the station platform and saw Thomas Ashford sitting on a bench, waiting for her. Thomas Ashford smiled as Elena froze on the platform. He looked relaxed, almost amused, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. Beside him stood 2 men she recognized as his employees, large, rough-looking men who worked his timber operations. "Miss Ashford, I confess, I'm disappointed. I'd hoped you'd be more sensible than your aunt." He stood slowly, brushing dust from his coat. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this? I've been doing this a very long time. I know every route out of this region, every train station, every road. Did you believe Hannah Webb was clever enough to fool me?" Elena's heart sank. He'd known all along. He'd let her run, let her make copies, let her think she'd escaped. And now he would take everything from her and probably kill her in the process. "The question now," Ashford continued, "is what to do with you. Your aunt was easy, a simple accident, quietly mourned, but you've involved others. The Webb family will need to be reminded of their place, perhaps some additional debt added to their contract, perhaps something more severe. You can't keep doing this." Elena's voice shook, but she forced the words out. "Slavery is over, you can't just." "Can't I?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I've been doing it for 30 years, Miss Ashford, through war, through Reconstruction, through all the supposedly great reforms. The laws changed, but the reality didn't. Power is power, money is money, fear is fear. Those 3 things together, they let you do anything you want if you're smart enough and ruthless enough. Someone will stop you, eventually. Perhaps, but not today, not you." He gestured to his men. "Take her back to town. We'll decide what to do with her once." "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice came from behind Elena. She turned and saw an elderly man in a suit stepping down from a passenger car that had arrived while her attention was fixed on Ashford. He was perhaps 70, with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Behind him came 2 younger men who had the bearing of federal marshals. "Senator Harrington." Ashford's face had gone pale. "This is unexpected." "Is it? I received a rather detailed letter from Miss Catherine Ashford 3 weeks ago, outlining allegations of illegal labor practices in this region. She requested I investigate personally. I was planning to arrive today regardless, but Miss Elena Ashford's telegram last night," he nodded at Elena, who stared at him in confusion, "suggested the matter was urgent. So I brought federal authorities with me." Elena's confusion must have shown on her face, because Harrington smiled gently. "Your aunt arranged everything before her death, my dear. She sent copies of certain records to me with instructions that if anything happened to her, I should investigate immediately. When you sent your telegram last night confirming her suspicions, I knew it was time to act. I didn't send any telegram. No, said a new voice, I did. Hannah Webb emerged from the station house, looking tired but determined. I sent it from the telegraph office 15 miles from here late last night after you left. Your aunt gave me the senator's address before she died, told me to contact him if things went bad. I figured hiding you in Hay wasn't going to be enough. We needed real help. So I sent the wire and hoped these gentlemen would arrive in time. Ashford's face had gone from pale to purple. You have no authority here. This is a state matter, not federal. You can't. Actually, I can. Harrington produced papers from his coat. I've been granted investigative authority by the Department of Justice. Seems your activities fall under federal purview when they involve violations of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Holding people in involuntary servitude, regardless of what you call it, is a federal crime. So is conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. The marshals moved forward, and Elena saw Ashford's employees step back, suddenly unwilling to involve themselves in what was clearly becoming a legal matter beyond their control. I want to see these supposed records, Ashford said, his voice strained. Allegations aren't evidence. Letters from dead women aren't testimony. No, but this is. Elena pulled the copies from inside her dress, her hands shaking but her voice steady. A complete ledger documenting your purchases of enslaved persons before the war and your continuation of the practice afterward under false debt contracts. Names, dates, amounts paid. And this, she pulled out a second set of papers Hannah had given her that morning. Sworn testimony from 23 people currently working under those false contracts, all willing to testify in federal court. Ashford lunged for the papers, but one of the marshals caught his arm. Mr. Ashford, you're under arrest. Federal charges of involuntary servitude, conspiracy, fraud, and about a dozen other violations. You'll be transporting to the state capitol for arraignment. You can't do this. I have rights. I have connections. Yes, you do have rights. The right to remain silent being one I'd suggest you exercise. The marshal produced handcuffs, and Elena watched as Thomas Ashford's face crumpled from rage to disbelief to something approaching fear. As they led him away, he turned to Elena, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over. I know people. I'll be out in a week, and when I am. Actually, you won't. Senator Harrington's voice was cold. I've already spoken with the state governor. Given the severity of these crimes and your documented history of intimidating witnesses, you'll be held without bail pending trial. And that trial will be federal, Mr. Ashford, not some local magistrate you've paid off. Real justice. They took him away, his protests fading as they loaded him into a secured car. Elena stood on the platform, feeling as if the world had tilted on its axis. It was over, actually over. Hannah touched her arm gently. Your aunt would be proud. She set all this in motion, knowing she wouldn't live to see it through, but she made sure someone would finish what she started. The others, Marcus, Anna, all the people on that list, they're free now. Senator Harrington nodded. The contracts are void. Federal marshals are already moving through the region notifying everyone affected. It will take time to sort out the legal details, but yes, they're free. And Mr. Ashford's assets will be seized to compensate them for their unpaid labor. It's not perfect justice, but it's a start. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. Relief, exhaustion, grief for the aunt she'd never truly known, but who'd given everything to make this moment possible. What happens now? She asked. Now you go back to Milford and continue teaching if that's what you want, or you go anywhere else. You're a free woman with no one holding power over you. The choice is yours, Miss Ashford, entirely yours. Elena returned to Milford 3 days after Thomas Ashford's arrest. The town felt different, quieter, if that was possible, but with an underlying current of nervous energy. People gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, glancing over their shoulders, as if they expected Ashford to materialize and punish them for daring to hope. The school children arrived on Monday morning with eyes that seemed less haunted. Marcus and Anna Webb's younger sister actually smiled at Elena, a small, fragile expression that vanished quickly but had been there nonetheless. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Fear hadn't evaporated overnight, but it had loosened its grip. Hannah Webb came to visit Elena that evening, bringing bread she'd baked and news from the federal marshals. They've been interviewing everyone on the list, taking testimony, documenting the false debt contracts, recording everything. Some folks are afraid to talk, spent so many years keeping quiet that speaking up feels dangerous, but most are cooperating. They want justice. They want compensation. They want acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. How are Marcus and Anna? Confused, relieved, angry, all at once. Hannah sat heavily in one of Elena's chairs, looking every one of her 70 years. They're trying to understand what it means to be free after believing for so long they'd never be. Marcus wants to leave, go north, start completely over. Anna wants to stay. This is home, despite everything. I suspect they'll compromise somehow. And you, what will you do? Hannah's smile was tired but genuine. I'll stay. I'm too old to start over somewhere new. Besides, someone needs to remember. Someone needs to make sure this place doesn't forget what happened here, doesn't sweep it all under the rug, and pretend the past doesn't matter. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Hannah spoke again, her voice lower. There's something you should know. Ashford's wife came to see me yesterday, Margaret. Elena straightened. What did she want? To talk, to confess, I suppose. She's been carrying secrets for 30 years, and now that her husband's gone, they're pouring out of her like poison from a wound. Hannah paused, choosing words carefully. She told me things about Thomas Ashford, things that explain why he was so obsessed with maintaining control, why he couldn't stop even when it became dangerous. What things? His past. Before he came here, before he made his fortune in slave trading, he was nobody. Born to poverty in Virginia, father unknown, mother died when he was young. He was raised in an orphanage, then apprenticed to a merchant who treated him brutally. When he finally escaped that situation, he was 18 years old with nothing but resentment and ambition. Hannah leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret says he became a slave trader because it was the one business where he could transform his worthlessness into power. Every person he bought and sold was proof he'd transcended his origins. Every dollar he made was validation. When the war ended and emancipation threatened his entire identity, he couldn't accept it. So he found ways to continue, called it by different names, but kept doing the same thing. It wasn't about money anymore. He had plenty. It was about maintaining the illusion that he was powerful, that he controlled others, that he was no longer the helpless boy in the orphanage. Elena felt an unwelcome stirring of something almost like pity. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't, but it helps explain it. Understanding evil doesn't mean forgiving it, it just means seeing it clearly. Hannah stood slowly, her joints creaking. Margaret also said something else. She said Thomas kept detailed records of everything because he was terrified of being exposed. Every transaction, every contract, every payment, all documented because he thought if anyone ever questioned him, he could use the paperwork to prove he was legitimate. Ironic, isn't it? The thing he thought would protect him became the evidence that destroyed him. After Hannah left, Elena sat alone in her aunt's house, her house now thinking about Thomas Ashford, not the monster who'd enslaved dozens of people, but the frightened boy he'd once been, turning his trauma into cruelty, his pain into power. She didn't forgive him, but she understood him a little better, and understanding brought its own kind of horror. The trial happened in early December, held in the state capitol, with federal prosecutors presenting the case. Elena traveled there to testify, as did Marcus, Anna, Hannah, and 15 others who'd been trapped under false debt contracts. The courtroom was packed with observers, journalists, activists, curious citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the charges. Thomas Ashford sat at the defense table looking diminished somehow, as if arrest and prosecution had physically shrunk him. His lawyer, a skilled attorney from Charleston, tried valiantly to argue that the contracts had been legitimate business arrangements, that the workers had agreed to the terms voluntarily, that there was no evidence of coercion. But the ledger told a different story. So did the testimony of people who described years of unpayable debt, threats of imprisonment, families torn apart when members tried to leave. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge, a stern man who'd served in the Union Army during the war, delivered a statement that resonated through the courtroom. Mr. Ashford, you have been convicted of recreating slavery through fraud and intimidation. You have exploited the vulnerable, profited from suffering, and corrupted the legal system meant to protect the weak from the powerful. The law grants me discretion in sentencing, but I see no reason for leniency. You are sentenced to 20 years hard labor in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Your assets are seized and will be distributed as compensation to your victims. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Ashford stared straight ahead as guards led him away. He didn't look at his wife, who sat pale and silent in the gallery. He didn't look at Alina or the others who'd testified against him. He looked at nothing, his eyes empty, his face blank. Whatever remained of Thomas Ashford, the person, had disappeared behind the wall of his conviction. Alina returned to Milford in time for Christmas. The town was changing, slowly but perceptibly. Families who'd been trapped were making plans, some to leave, some to stay and rebuild. Marcus Webb had accepted a job at a factory in Philadelphia and would leave in the spring. Anna had decided to stay and help her grandmother, but she spoke now about opening a small store, about building something of her own. The school felt different too. Children spoke more freely, laughed occasionally, asked questions without fear. Parents attended meetings Alina organized, discussing their children's education and their hopes for the future. It wasn't paradise. Fear and trauma didn't heal overnight, but it was better, markedly, measurably better. On Christmas Eve, Alina stood in the empty schoolhouse, looking at the small tree the children had decorated with paper ornaments. She thought about her aunt, who died to expose the truth, about Hannah, who'd risked everything to help finish what her aunt started, about the 23 people who'd lived in slavery's shadow and were now stepping into light. She thought about Thomas Ashford too, the monster and the damaged child, the tyrant and the frightened orphan. Understanding his pain didn't excuse his crimes, but it reminded her that evil often grew from suffering, that cruelty often emerged from fear, that people who hurt others were often themselves deeply hurt. It didn't make forgiveness easier, but it made revenge less satisfying, and somehow that felt like its own kind of justice. Spring came late to Milford that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought warmth that seemed to thaw more than just the frozen ground. Alina had been teaching for 6 months now, and the school had become something more than just a place of learning. It was a community center where people gathered to discuss the future, to plan reconstruction, to imagine possibilities that had been unthinkable under Ashford's rule. The town itself was transforming. Several families trapped under false debt contracts had used their compensation to purchase land, starting small farms of their own. Others had left for opportunities in larger cities, seeking fresh starts where the weight of the past didn't press quite so heavily. New people arrived too, workers looking for employment in a region where labor was suddenly valued properly and paid fairly. But the past refused to stay buried. In April, a lawyer from Charleston arrived at Alina's house, carrying a sealed envelope. He was a young man, nervous and apologetic, who explained he'd been engaged by Margaret Ashford to deliver correspondence after her death. Mrs. Ashford died 3 days ago, he said. Consumption, she'd been ill for months. Before she passed, she gave me this letter with instructions to deliver it to you personally. She said it contained information you had a right to know. Alina took the envelope with trembling hands. After the lawyer departed, she sat at her aunt's desk, and broke the seal. Dear Miss Ashford, by the time you read this, I will be dead. I welcome death as release from a life I have found unbearable for many years. My illness is a mercy, freeing me from a world where I have been complicit in terrible things. I write to tell you truths I should have spoken long ago, but lacked the courage to voice, while my husband still lived and threatened. Now, With Thomas in prison and death approaching, I find I cannot take these secrets to my grave. Your Aunt Catherine was not simply a woman who discovered my husband's crimes. She had personal reasons for investigating him, reasons she never revealed to anyone, perhaps not even to you. I believe you deserve to understand. 28 years ago, in 1861, Thomas Ashford purchased a young woman named Sarah at a Charleston slave auction. She was 14 years old, light-skinned, educated, exactly the type Thomas preferred to buy for resale to wealthy families who wanted refined servants. Sarah was pregnant when Thomas bought her, though he didn't discover this until later. When he learned of her condition, he was furious. Pregnant slaves were harder to sell, less valuable. He kept her in a locked room at our house for months, planning to sell both mother and child once the baby was born. The baby was born in March 1862. A girl. Thomas sold her almost immediately to a family in Savannah. I never knew their names. He sold Sarah separately to a plantation owner in Georgia, deliberately separating mother and child as punishment for what he called Sarah's deception. Your Aunt Catherine was Sarah. The child Thomas sold was you. Elena dropped the letter as if it had burned her. Her hands shook violently. The words couldn't be true. They couldn't. She picked up the letter again, forcing herself to continue reading through tears that blurred the ink. I know this is devastating news, but you must understand the full truth. Sarah, your mother, was herself the daughter of a white plantation owner and an enslaved woman. She'd been raised in the owner's house, educated alongside his legitimate children, treated with relative kindness until she became pregnant. When the owner's wife discovered her condition, she sold Sarah to the first trader who appeared, wanting her gone before the pregnancy showed. Thomas never knew or cared who had fathered Sarah's child. But I knew because Sarah told me, screaming and weeping as Thomas locked her in that room. She said the father was the plantation owner's son, a young man who'd promised to marry her, who'd claimed to love her, who'd abandoned her the moment she told him about the pregnancy. After Thomas sold you, Sarah somehow escaped the plantation where she'd been sent. She spent years searching for you, following rumors and traces across the South. Eventually, she learned your location, a family in Savannah who'd renamed you Catherine and raised you as their ward, never telling you about your origins. By then, you were 15 years old. Sarah watched you from a distance, saw that you were healthy and educated, saw that you'd built a life. She never approached you, afraid that revealing the truth would destroy the stability you'd found. Instead, she took employment as a seamstress in Charleston, watching over you as best she could from afar. When you married and moved away, she continued to track your life through letters and occasional visits disguised as chance encounters. When your husband died and you came to Milford to live near me, she followed, taking a position as a servant in a nearby town where she could observe without being recognized. She never told you who she was, but when she discovered that Thomas Ashford, the man who'd sold you and destroyed her life, lived in Milford, she couldn't remain silent. She came to me, told me everything, begged me to help her gather evidence against him. I refused. I was afraid of Thomas, afraid of what he might do if I betrayed him. Sarah left angry and devastated. 3 days later, she was found dead in a stream outside town. The authorities called it an accidental drowning, but I knew better. Thomas had her killed to prevent her from speaking. You came to Milford not knowing any of this, but Thomas recognized something in you immediately, the same features Sarah had possessed, the same bearing. He realized you must be Sarah's daughter and became paranoid that you would somehow discover the truth. When you began investigating his activities, following your aunt's research, Thomas saw it as confirmation of his worst fears. He believed you knew everything and was seeking revenge for what he'd done to your mother. That's why he was so determined to stop you, to destroy you before you could destroy him. I write this now because you deserve to know who you are. You are the daughter of Sarah, a woman who loved you enough to sacrifice her own happiness to ensure yours. You are also the granddaughter of people who held others in bondage, the product of a system built on suffering and exploitation. This knowledge will not be easy to bear, but I believe understanding the truth is always preferable to living in ignorance. however painful that truth might be. I am sorry for my cowardice. I am sorry I didn't help Sarah when she begged me to. I am sorry I remained silent while my husband committed terrible crimes. I am sorry for everything I failed to do and everything I failed to be. May you find peace that has eluded me. Margaret Ashford. Elena sat motionless for a long time, the letter fallen from numb fingers. Her entire understanding of herself had shattered. She wasn't Catherine Ashford's niece. She was Elena, or was she? Who had she been before the family in Savannah renamed her? Who was she now? Her mother hadn't been a distant relative who'd left her a house. Her mother had been Sarah, a woman who'd loved her enough to watch from the shadows, who'd died trying to bring justice to the man who destroyed both their lives. And the woman she'd known as her aunt, Catherine, had been Sarah's friend, Sarah's ally, Sarah's final hope. The crying came suddenly, great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the mother she'd never known, for the years they'd lost, for the truth that had come too late. She cried for Catherine, who'd died continuing Sarah's work. She cried for herself, for the identity she'd thought she possessed and the uncertain legacy she'd inherited. When the tears finally stopped, Elena sat in the quiet house and began to piece together the fragments of truth. Her mother had been enslaved. Her grandfather, the plantation owner who'd fathered Sarah, had owned human beings. She carried both histories in her blood, the enslaved and the enslaver, the victim and the victimizer. There was no simple innocence in that lineage, no clear side to claim. She was the product of violence and suffering, of rape disguised as romance, of a system that had made such horrors routine and legal. But she was also herself, Elena, shaped by the choices she'd made, the courage she'd shown, the justice she'd pursued. Her mother's sacrifice and Catherine's determination had given her the freedom to choose who she would become, regardless of who her ancestors had been. That night, Elena walked to the cemetery on the hill outside town. She found two graves there, both marked with simple stones. One read, Catherine Ashford, 1824-1888, teacher, friend, seeker of justice. The other, newer, read, Sarah, 1830-1888, beloved mother. Elena knelt between them, placing flowers she'd gathered from the garden. Thank you, she whispered, both of you. Thank you for the life you gave me, for the truth you sought, for the courage you showed. I'll honor you both by continuing the work you started, I promise. The wind stirred the trees, and in its whisper, Elena thought she heard something that might have been acceptance, might have been peace. She had a mother she'd never known and a history she couldn't change. But she had a future she could shape, a life she could live with purpose, a legacy she could build on truth rather than lies. That would have to be enough. 5 years passed before Elena returned to Milford for the last time. She'd left not long after discovering the truth about her parentage, accepting a position at a school in the state capital where she could do more to advance the cause of education for all children, regardless of their background. The work had been fulfilling and exhausting in equal measure, but she'd built something meaningful, a model school that others were beginning to replicate, a demonstration that investment in education could transform communities. Now, in the spring of 1894, she returned to close this chapter of her life permanently. The house she'd inherited, the house where her mother had watched over her from a distance, where Catherine had planned justice she wouldn't live to see, was being donated to become a community library. It seemed the appropriate final gesture. Milford had continued to change in her absence. The school had a new teacher, a young man from Boston with progressive ideas about education. Several of the families formerly enslaved under Ashford's contracts had become prosperous farmers and business owners. Hannah Webb, still alive at 75, ran a small store that served as an informal community center. Marcus had returned from Philadelphia with his wife and children, ready to build a future in a town that finally offered hope. But some shadows remained. Thomas Ashford had died in prison 2 years earlier, his health destroyed by hard labor and the weight of his crimes. His daughter Constance had moved far away, married under a new name, desperate to escape her father's legacy. The Ashford mansion stood empty and abandoned, slowly falling to ruin as no one wanted to purchase property so tainted by history. Elena spent a week in Milford, organizing her affairs and saying farewell to people who'd become important to her. On her final day, Hannah Webb invited her to tea, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching spring rain fall on the muddy street outside. "You did good here," Hannah said finally. "You and your mother and Catherine, you broke something that needed breaking. People are free who wouldn't have been. Children are learning who would have been trapped in ignorance. That matters. But it's not finished, is it? The system that created Ashford, that made his crimes possible, it's still out there. Changed, maybe, hidden better, but not gone." Hannah nodded slowly. "No, it's not gone. There are other Ashfords in other towns, finding new ways to exploit and control. The laws are better now, but laws only matter if people enforce them. Justice only exists when people fight for it. You know that better than anyone. Then why does it feel like we barely made a dent?" "Because you're measuring wrong. You're looking at the whole country, all the injustice everywhere, and feeling overwhelmed. Look smaller. Look at this town. Look at the families who are free because of what you did. Look at the children in that school learning they have value and rights and futures. That's not a small thing, Elena. That's everything." Elena thought about the ledger, still preserved as evidence even though the trial had long since concluded. 23 names, 23 people freed, set against the millions who'd been enslaved, the hundreds of thousands still trapped in various forms of exploitative labor across the South. It seemed insignificant. But Hannah was right. Every person mattered. Every freedom won mattered. The work of justice wasn't about solving everything at once. It was about doing what you could, where you were, with what you had. That evening, Elena walked to the cemetery one final time. Maury Grave had appeared since her last visit, natural deaths of people who'd lived full lives, not tragedies cut short by cruelty and injustice. She knelt between Sarah's grave and Catherine's, feeling the weight of their legacy settling on her shoulders. "I understand now," she said quietly, "why you did what you did, why you sacrificed what you sacrificed. You were fighting not just for me, but for everyone, for the idea that people matter, that freedom matters, that truth matters." She paused, wiping away tears. "I'm not staying in Milford, but I'm not running away either. I'm going where I can do the most good, help the most people, create the most change. That's what you'd want, isn't it? Not monument or ceremony, but continued work, continued struggle, continued hope that we can build something better." The wind stirred the trees, carrying the scent of rain and growing things. Elena stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, and walked down the hill toward town. She had a train to catch, a life to live, work to continue. Behind her, the Grave remained silent and peaceful, the dead at rest, while the living carried on their battle. 20 years later, in 1914, an elderly Elena would stand before a group of young teachers at a conference in New York, sharing the story of Milford, the town that had harbored slavery long after slavery's official end, the man who'd maintained it through fear and fraud, the women who'd sacrificed everything to expose the truth. "The work of justice is never finished," she would tell them. "Each generation must take up the fight anew, must challenge the systems of oppression in their own time, must refuse to accept that cruelty and exploitation are inevitable. You carry forward the legacy of people who fought before you. Honor them by continuing their work. Honor them by refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. Honor them by teaching the next generation that freedom is not given but claimed, not passive but active, not individual but collective." The teachers would listen, take notes, ask questions. Some would go on to create schools in their own communities, would fight their own battles against injustice, would pass on the lessons Elena taught. Others would forget, would be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems they faced, would give up. But some, a few, a critical few, would remember, would act, would continue the work that Sarah began, that Catherine died for, that Elena carried forward. And perhaps that was enough, not perfect, not complete, but enough. In Milford, the abandoned Ashford mansion finally collapsed in a winter storm 1923, its rotted timbers giving way, its dark rooms open to sky and weather. The land where it stood remained empty for decades, as if the earth itself rejected new building on that cursed ground. But in the cemetery on the hill, wildflowers grew around two simple graves, planted by hands unknown, locals who remembered, perhaps, or visitors who'd heard the story and wanted to pay respects. The stones stood clean and readable, maintained by people who understood the importance of remembering even when remembering hurt. Sarah, 1832-1888, beloved mother. Catherine Ashford, 1824-1888, teacher, friend, seeker of justice. And in the town below, in the school that still stood, in the library that had been Alina's gift, in the farms and businesses and homes of people who'd been freed from bondage, in all these places, life continued. Not perfect, not without struggle, but free in ways that would have been impossible before three women refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. The horror of Milford was not the melodramatic terror of Gothic novels, no ghosts, no supernatural vengeance, no cosmic punishment for sins. The horror was quieter, more insidious. The horror of ordinary people maintaining systems of cruelty through fear and silence. The horror of injustice normalized until it became invisible. The horror of suffering accepted as inevitable rather than intolerable. But if there was horror in what happened, there was also hope in how it ended, not with perfect justice, but with imperfect courage. Not with revenge, but with resistance. Not with forgetting, but with remembering and refusing to let the same patterns repeat. And perhaps, in the end, that was the real lesson, that horror is defeated not by heroes or miracles, but by ordinary people who choose to act when action is dangerous, who choose to speak when silence is safer, who choose to remember when forgetting would be easier. The ledger still exists, preserved in a museum in the state capital, a reminder of what was and what must never be again. Sometimes, visitors stand before it, reading the names, imagining the lives behind those entries. Teachers bring students to see it, to learn that history is not distant and abstract, but immediate and personal, made by individuals who chose either to maintain injustice or to challenge it. And somewhere in those names, in those dates, in those cold numerical amounts, lives the story of Sarah and Catherine and Alina, three women across two generations who refused to accept that their world couldn't change, who paid terrible prices for that refusal, and who left behind a legacy not of perfection, but of persistence. That is the story of Milford, a ghost town now barely remembered except in historical texts and occasional academic studies. But what happened there echoes still in the ongoing work of justice, in the continued struggle against exploitation, in the persistent hope that each generation can build something better than what it inherited. The horror was real, the suffering was real, the injustice was real. But so was the resistance, so was the courage, so was the change. And in that imperfect, incomplete, ongoing struggle lies the only answer horror ever receives, not the absence of darkness, but the refusal to surrender to it.